Riverside Medical Center, known as a pinnacle of healthcare excellence in the bustling suburban community of Willow Creek, prided itself on its prestigious reputation. Behind its pristine walls and gleaming facilities, however, lay an undercurrent of tension that would soon be exposed in ways no one could have predicted. When Lisa Daniels, a talented and determined black nurse, joined their staff, she anticipated the challenges that came with working at a renowned institution. What she didn't expect was the hostility lurking behind polite smiles and whispered conversations. Yet, amidst the growing tension, a seemingly ordinary patient named James Mitchell is observed silently from his hospital bed. But James wasn't just any patient. Unbeknownst to everyone, his presence would unravel secrets and spark a reckoning that would shake Riverside to its very foundation. What hidden influence did James wield, and how could one nurse's quiet strength ignite a revolution? Let's dive into this powerful story. But before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you enjoy tales filled with unexpected twists and moments of justice, make sure to hit that subscribe button. The automated doors of Riverside Medical Center slid open as Lisa Daniels stepped inside, clutching her bag tightly. The morning light streaming through the vast glass windows illuminated the lobby's polished floors, the faint scent of disinfectant mingling with the hum of activity. To any outsider, it was a scene of seamless professionalism, a well-oiled machine where everyone had their place. To Lisa, it was a fresh start, and a chance to prove herself. She had spent years overcoming obstacles to earn this opportunity, graduating at the top of her nursing class despite countless doubters. Yet, as she took her first steps into the hospital, a knot tightened in her stomach. Something about the air felt off. The smiles she passed were polite but distant, and conversations seemed to hush whenever she came near. Lisa straightened her back and walked toward the reception desk, determined to make a strong first impression. "Good morning," she said with a warm smile. "I'm Lisa Daniels, the new nurse starting today. Could you direct me to the nursing office?" The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with a perfectly coiffed bob, glanced up from her computer. Her smile was tight, her tone clipped. "Third floor, end of the hall. Head Nurse Wilson's office." Lisa nodded politely and turned toward the elevators, her sensible shoes clicking against the tile floor. But as she walked away, she couldn't ignore the faint whispers behind her. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, dismissive, skeptical. She had felt it before, and it stung just the same. As Lisa entered the bustling third floor, she immediately felt a shift in the atmosphere. Nurses moved briskly between rooms, their voices echoing off the sterile walls. Yet, the moment she approached the nurses' station, the activity seemed to falter. Conversations trailed off, and pairs of eyes glanced her way before quickly looking elsewhere. Lisa felt the heat rise in her cheeks but forced a smile, determined to project confidence. "I'm looking for Head Nurse Wilson," Lisa announced, addressing a blonde nurse with piercing blue eyes who stood behind the counter. The nurse looked up, her expression momentarily startled before it softened into a polite, practiced smile. "That's me," she said, her tone cool. "You must be Lisa Daniels. Welcome to Riverside." Lisa extended her hand, but Head Nurse Wilson didn't take it. Instead, she handed Lisa a clipboard stacked with forms. "Here's your onboarding paperwork. Let's go over it quickly. We're short-staffed today, so I'll need you on the floor as soon as possible." Lisa's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. "Of course, I'm ready to get started." Wilson's lips tightened into what could barely pass for a smile. "Good. You'll need to be." Lisa was quickly thrust into the whirlwind of hospital life. Shadowing other nurses, she began familiarizing herself with the layout and procedures. But as she worked, she couldn't ignore the subtle ways she was excluded. Conversations that stopped as she approached. tasks handed to her without explanation, the occasional sideways glance that lingered too long. As she passed room 407, she noticed a man sitting upright in the hospital bed, flipping through a newspaper. His cast-covered arm rested on a pillow, and his sharp eyes scanned the pages with an air of quiet authority. He looked up as Lisa walked by, their eyes meeting for a brief moment. There was nothing overtly remarkable about him, but something in his gaze gave Lisa pause. It wasn't cold or dismissive like many of the other looks she'd received that day. It was calm, steady, curious. Lisa offered a polite nod before continuing down the hall, the moment slipping from her mind. By midday, Lisa's confidence had taken several hits. During a lunch break in the staff lounge, she tried striking up a conversation with two other nurses seated at the table. "Busy day, huh?" Lisa said with a light laugh, opening her lunch container. The nurses exchanged glances before one of them replied, "Yeah, it always is." Her tone was curt, and she immediately turned back to her companion, shutting Lisa out of the conversation. Lisa sighed inwardly, focusing on her meal. She knew the cold reception wasn't entirely unexpected. Newcomers often had to earn their place in such environments. But there was something more to it, something unspoken but palpable. The afternoon brought Lisa face to face with Dr. Richard Hayes, a senior physician whose reputation for excellence was matched only by whispers of his arrogance. She spotted him in the hallway, a tall figure in a pristine white coat, his salt and pepper hair perfectly styled. "Dr. Hayes," Lisa said, extending her hand. "I'm Lisa Daniels, the new nurse." He paused, his gray eyes sweeping over her with an expression that was impossible to read. Slowly, he extended his hand but didn't shake hers with much warmth. "Welcome," he said, his tone clipped. "I trust you've been briefed on our standards. We expect nothing but the best here at Riverside." "Absolutely," Lisa replied, her smile unwavering. "I'm ready to meet those expectations." "Good," Hayes said, though his tone implied skepticism. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Lisa standing in the hallway, her hand falling to her side. The day wore on, and Lisa's duties took her past room 407 several more times. Each time, James Mitchell was there, watching quietly. His presence was unassuming, but there was a weight to his gaze, as if he were seeing more than what was on the surface. As Lisa walked back to the nurses' station to finish her shift, she couldn't shake the feeling that her arrival at Riverside was only the beginning of a much larger story. And little did she know, the man in room 407 would play a pivotal role in changing everything. The day began with a flurry of activity as Lisa adjusted to her new surroundings, trying her best to blend into the fast-paced rhythm of Riverside Medical Center. The clipped tones of conversations, the steady beep of monitors, and the constant shuffle of hurried footsteps created a symphony of urgency. Lisa's first tasks were straightforward: shadowing other nurses, assisting with minor patient care, and familiarizing herself with the hospital's extensive protocols. Yet, it was clear that her presence was met with mixed reactions. Some of her colleagues offered polite, professional acknowledgement, keeping their interactions brief and distant. Others, however, barely concealed their disdain. A pair of nurses at the station glanced her way, whispering and exchanging amused smiles before returning to their work. Lisa ignored it, reminding herself to focus on her duties. She wasn't here to make friends. She was here to prove herself. Still, the chilly reception gnawed at her, a sharp contrast to the warmth she'd hoped for when she walked through those glass doors that morning. Mid-morning, Lisa was reviewing a patient chart when she heard someone clearing their throat. She turned to find herself face-to-face with Dr. Richard Hayes. Tall, impeccably dressed in his white coat, and carrying an air of authority that could intimidate even the most seasoned staff members. Dr. Hayes regarded Lisa with a gaze that seemed to pierce through her. His salt-and-pepper hair and neatly groomed appearance gave him an aura of seniority, but the coldness in his expression quickly dispelled any sense of welcome. "Dr. Hayes," Lisa said, offering her hand with a smile she hoped would convey confidence. "I'm Lisa Daniels, the new nurse." Dr. Hayes glanced at her extended hand briefly before shaking it with the kind of grip that felt more like a formality than a greeting. "Lisa Daniels," he repeated, his tone as impersonal as if he were reading her name off a clipboard. His sharp gray eyes scanned her from head to toe, his expression unreadable. "I trust you've been properly briefed on the standards we uphold here." "Yes, I have," Lisa replied, keeping her tone professional. "I'm looking forward to contributing." Dr. Hayes raised an eyebrow, a flicker of skepticism crossing his face. "Good. We have a reputation to maintain, and I expect all my staff to meet those expectations. I hope you're up to the task." He didn't wait for her response before stepping past her, his coat billowing slightly as he moved down the hall. Lisa's hand dropped slowly to her side, her smile fading. The interaction left her feeling like a child being scolded by a strict teacher, and she couldn't shake the impression that Dr. Hayes had already formed an opinion of her, and not a favorable one. As Lisa returned to her work, she couldn't help but notice the ripple effect Dr. Hayes seemed to have on the staff. Nurses straightened their postures, their chatter subdued as he strode past. A junior doctor quickly adjusted his clipboard, muttering a rushed greeting that Dr. Hayes barely acknowledged. It was clear that his presence demanded respect, or, more accurately, fear. Determined not to let the encounter rattle her, Lisa focused on her tasks, moving between rooms and assisting with patient care. During a routine round, she entered room 407, her attention briefly drawn to the man in the bed, James Mitchell. His chart indicated he was in his early 50s, admitted for complications from a fractured arm sustained in an accident. His hair, neatly trimmed and peppered with gray, gave him a distinguished appearance, and his piercing eyes had a quiet intensity. Unlike many patients who seemed either irritated or resigned to their hospital stays, James exuded a calm, collected energy that was almost unnerving. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell." Lisa greeted him with a warm smile. "I'm Nurse Daniels. I'll be assisting with your care." James looked up from the book he'd been reading, his gaze meeting hers with an unreadable expression. "Good morning," he replied, his voice smooth and polite. "A new face around here?" "Yes, today's my first day," Lisa said, stepping closer to check his vitals. "How are you feeling?" "Better than I expected," James said, his tone neutral but observant. He watched her closely as she worked, his sharp eyes seeming to take in more than just her actions. "And you? How's your first day treating you?" Lisa paused, caught off guard by the question. Patients rarely showed interest in the personal lives of their nurses. "It's been busy," she admitted, choosing her words carefully. "But I'm settling in." James gave a slight nod, his expression unreadable. "You'll do fine," he said simply, turning back to his book. Lisa finished her tasks and left the room, feeling an odd sense of reassurance from his words despite their brevity. The rest of the day brought more challenges. Lisa found herself assigned to the most demanding patients, often without the support typically afforded to new hires. At one point, she struggled to maneuver a heavy piece of equipment on her own, her request for help met with an excuse from a nearby nurse who claimed to be too busy. Lisa gritted her teeth and handled the task herself, determined not to let anyone see her frustration. Later, during her break, Lisa overheard two nurses talking near the vending machines. Their voices were low, but the disdain in their tone was unmistakable. "Did you see the new hire?" one said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Yeah," the other replied with a smirk. "I don't know what they were thinking. She's not exactly what you'd expect for a place like this." Lisa's hand tightened around her water bottle. She had heard similar comments before in other settings, and while she'd learned to tune them out, the sting was no less sharp. She returned to the staff lounge and sat at an empty table, quietly eating her lunch as the other nurses carried on their conversations without acknowledging her presence. As the day wound down, Lisa found herself passing room 407 again. James was still there, but this time he wasn't reading. He was watching. His eyes followed her as she moved past, a faint expression of curiosity on his face. Lisa hesitated for a moment, meeting his gaze briefly before continuing down the hall. She couldn't quite place it, but something about James Mitchell felt different. In the final hour of her shift, Lisa was approached by a senior nurse who handed her a stack of patient files. "Dr. Hayes wants you to review these before tomorrow," the nurse said briskly, her tone leaving no room for argument. Lisa accepted the files without complaint, though the weight of them felt heavier than just paper. As she walked back to the nurse's station, she noticed Dr. Hayes speaking with a group of doctors nearby. His voice carried just enough for her to catch fragments of the conversation. "Need people who can handle the pressure. Not everyone is cut out for this environment," he was saying, his tone laced with thinly veiled criticism. Though he didn't glance in her direction, Lisa had the distinct feeling his words were aimed at her. By the time her shift ended, Lisa felt both physically and emotionally drained. As she gathered her things from her locker, she thought about the challenges she had faced that day. The subtle slights, the dismissive attitudes, the constant sense of being watched and judged. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she had come too far to give up now. Walking past the rows of patient rooms on her way out, Lisa once again passed room 407. This time, James Mitchell nodded to her as if acknowledging something unspoken. Lisa returned the gesture, a small flicker of strength reigniting within her. She wasn't sure why, but she felt as though James had seen something in her that others refused to acknowledge. As Lisa stepped outside into the cool evening air, she took a deep breath, steeling herself for the days to come. Little did she know, the events that would soon unfold at Riverside Medical Center would test her resolve in ways she could never have imagined, and James Mitchell would play a pivotal role in the story that was about to begin. The following morning, Lisa arrived at Riverside Medical Center determined to approach the day with fresh resolve. She reminded herself that every job came with growing pains, and she refused to let the previous day's challenges define her experience. Still, as she stepped into the brightly lit halls, the undercurrent of tension she'd felt before seemed even more palpable. Nurses rushed past her, their faces neutral, their greetings clipped, and she couldn't help but notice the subtle glances cast her way, quick, fleeting, and often followed by whispered remarks. Her first assignment came from head nurse Wilson, who handed her a clipboard with a stack of patient charts. "These are your patients for the day," Wilson said, her tone brisk. "You'll be handling rooms 306, 309, and 312. Be thorough, and remember, we have no room for errors." Lisa nodded, scanning the charts as Wilson walked away. Each of the patients assigned to her had complicated cases. One required extensive wound care, another had a history of combative behavior, and the third was a post-operative patient with numerous complications. It didn't escape her notice that her assignments were disproportionately challenging compared to those of her colleagues, many of whom were handling routine cases. Lisa took a steadying breath. She had faced difficult tasks before, and she would rise to this challenge as well. Her first stop was room 306, where an elderly woman named Mrs. Carter was recovering from a recent surgery. The moment Lisa entered, Mrs. Carter narrowed her eyes. "You're not my usual nurse," she said sharply, clutching the edge of her blanket. "Where's Emily?" Lisa offered a warm smile, her voice calm and professional. "Emily is off today, but I'll be taking care of you. Let's check your vitals and see how you're feeling." Mrs. Carter frowned, her gaze scrutinizing Lisa as if searching for a reason to protest. "Fine," she said begrudgingly, "but don't mess anything up." Despite the patient's gruff demeanor, Lisa remained patient and thorough, ensuring Mrs. Carter was comfortable before moving on. As she left the room, she overheard two nurses at the station nearby. "She's got room 306, one of them said, her tone filled with mock surprise. "Good luck. Mrs. Carter's a handful." The other nurse laughed quietly. "They're throwing her to the wolves already. Guess they're testing how long she'll last." Lisa felt her cheeks burn but kept walking. She wasn't about to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her affected by their comments. Instead, she focused on her next patient, a middle-aged man named Mr. Larson in room 309. According to his chart, he had a history of aggressive behavior and had already refused care from two other nurses that morning. When Lisa entered his room, Mr. Larson's scowl deepened. "What do you want?" he snapped, crossing his arms over his chest. "I already told them I don't need any help." "Good morning, Mr. Larson," Lisa said, keeping her tone steady. "I'm here to check on your IV and make sure you're comfortable. I'll be quick." "I said I'm fine," he barked, his voice rising. "Why don't you go bother someone else?" Lisa hesitated, weighing her options. She could push forward and risk escalating his anger, or she could try a different approach. "I understand," she said gently, lowering her voice. "It's been a tough morning, and the last thing you probably want is more interruptions. I'll check your IV and be out of your way in no time." Mr. Larson's glare softened slightly, though his posture remained defensive. "Fine, but make it quick." True to her word, Lisa worked efficiently, adjusting his IV and ensuring everything was in order before leaving the room. As she stepped into the hallway, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Just as she was gathering her thoughts, Dr. Hayes appeared at the end of the corridor. He strode toward her, clipboard in hand, his expression as sharp as ever. "Nurse Daniels," he called out, his voice cutting through the chatter of the nearby nurses. "A word." Lisa approached him, keeping her head high despite the sinking feeling in her stomach. "Yes, Dr. Hayes?" He held up a patient chart, tapping it with his pen. "The notes on Mr. Larson's medication are incomplete. Did you not think it was important to record the exact dosage he received this morning?" Lisa frowned, confused. "I double-checked his chart before administering the medication, and the dosage was already recorded. I didn't administer anything new." Dr. Hayes raised an eyebrow, his lips curving into a faint smirk. "Then perhaps you should familiarize yourself with our charting system. We don't leave room for ambiguity here." Lisa opened her mouth to respond but stopped herself, realizing it wouldn't matter. The exchange wasn't about clarification, it was about undermining her. "Understood," she said calmly. "I'll double-check the notes." As Dr. Hayes turned and walked away, Lisa noticed the nearby nurses watching the interaction with thinly veiled amusement. One of them whispered something to her colleague, and they both laughed quietly. Lisa clenched her fists at her sides but said nothing, forcing herself to refocus on her remaining tasks. By midday, the weight of the morning's challenges had begun to wear on her. During her lunch break, she found a quiet corner of the staff lounge and called her mother. "Hey, Mama," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lisa, baby, how's it going?" Her mother's warm voice came through the phone, a balm to Lisa's frayed nerves. "It's a lot," Lisa admitted, blinking back the sting of tears. "I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I didn't expect it to feel like this." Her mother's tone softened. "You listen to me, Lisa Marie Daniels. You've worked too hard to let anyone make you feel like you don't belong. You're not just doing this for yourself. You're doing it for every little girl who dreams of standing where you are." Lisa closed her eyes, letting her mother's words sink in. "Thanks, Mama. I needed that." "Anytime, baby. Now hold your head high and show them what you're made of." With renewed determination, Lisa returned to her shift, determined to finish the day strong. Her final assignment brought her to room 312, where a post-operative patient required careful monitoring. The work was tedious, requiring precision and focus, but Lisa tackled it with the same professionalism she had maintained all day. As she made her way back to the nurse's station, she overheard another conversation between two staff members. "She's still here," one said, laughing quietly. "I thought she'd quit by now." The other chuckled. "Give it time. They always crack eventually." Lisa's grip tightened on the files in her hand. The words stung, but she refused to let them break her. She finished her shift with quiet determination, knowing that she couldn't control the behavior of others, but she could control how she responded. As she left the hospital that evening, Lisa passed by room 407 once more. James Mitchell was sitting up in bed, his sharp eyes watching her as she walked by. This time, he gave her a faint nod, and Lisa, despite her exhaustion, returned the gesture with a small smile. Something about James's quiet observation gave her strength, as though he saw the effort she was putting into a system that seemed determined to push her out. Lisa stepped out into the cool evening air, the weight of the day pressing down on her shoulders. But as her mother's words echoed in her mind, she squared her shoulders and reminded herself that she wasn't alone in this fight. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, but she would face them head-on, determined to prove that she belonged. That evening, after another grueling day at the Riverside Medical Center, Lisa sat on the edge of her small apartment's couch, staring at her phone. Her fingers hovered over her mother's contact before she finally pressed the call button. As the phone rang, Lisa's chest tightened. She had managed to hold herself together through her shift, but now, in the quiet of her home, the weight of the past 2 days felt unbearable. "Hey, baby girl," her mother's familiar voice came through, warm and steady, instantly soothing Lisa's frayed nerves. "Hey, Mama," Lisa replied, her voice soft and uneven. She tried to steady it, but the exhaustion seeped through. Her mother hummed knowingly. "What's wrong? I can hear it in your voice." Lisa hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much to reveal. She didn't want to sound like she was complaining, or worse, doubting herself. But her mother had always been her anchor, and right now, she needed to feel grounded. "It's harder than I thought it would be," Lisa admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "The work itself isn't the problem. It's everything else." Mrs. Daniels was silent for a moment, giving Lisa space to elaborate. "They're distant, Mama. The other nurses, the doctors. I can feel it every time I walk into a room, the way they look at me, the way they talk when they think I'm not listening." Her voice cracked slightly, and she quickly cleared her throat. "And Dr. Hayes, he talks to me like I'm already failing, even when I haven't done anything wrong." "Baby girl," Mrs. Daniels said, her tone soft but firm, "you listen to me. You've always had to fight harder, and you've always come out stronger. Don't you let them see you falter. You're there because you're good at what you do, not because someone handed you that spot. You earned it." "I know," Lisa said, though her voice betrayed the doubt creeping into her mind. "No," her mother pressed, her voice rising with conviction. "You need to believe it. Do you remember what I told you when you got that scholarship to nursing school?" Lisa smiled faintly. "That I was going to have to work twice as hard as everyone else because they'd always question if I belonged." "And did you?" her mother asked pointedly. "I worked harder than anyone," Lisa replied, the memory filling her chest with a small flicker of pride. "That's right," Mrs. Daniels said, "and you're going to do the same thing here. You come from a line of strong women, Lisa. You've got the strength of your grandmother, who raised 6 kids while working double shifts as a nurse, and the strength of your great-grandmother, who cleaned houses and still found time to teach her children how to read. You've got that same strength in you, and no one can take it away." Lisa closed her eyes, letting her mother's words sink in. For the first time that day, she felt the knot in her chest loosen slightly. "Thanks, Mama," she said softly. "I needed that." "You're welcome," Mrs. Daniels said, her tone softening. "Now, get some rest. You've got another big day ahead of you." After hanging up, Lisa sat quietly for a moment, replaying the conversation in her mind. Her mother's unwavering belief in her was like a balm on her wounded confidence. But as the evening wore on, Lisa's thoughts drifted to her time in nursing school, and the memories brought a mix of pride and lingering bitterness. Lisa remembered her first clinical rotation vividly. She was one of only a handful of black students in her cohort, and while most of her peers had been friendly, there were always a few who seemed to view her as an outsider. One professor in particular had made her feel the weight of being different. "Daniels," he had said during a particularly intense lecture, his tone dripping with condescension, "do you think you can manage this dosage calculation, or should we wait for someone else to answer?" The question wasn't about the dosage. It was about whether Lisa belonged. She had felt every eye in the room turn to her, some sympathetic, others expectant. Her hands had trembled slightly as she worked through the problem in her head, but when she answered, her voice had been steady. 1.5 milligrams, she had said, meeting the professor's gaze directly. The professor had nodded curtly, moving on without acknowledging her correctness. But Lisa had noticed the smirk on one classmate's face and the whisper that followed. Guess she can do math after all. Despite the microaggressions, Lisa had thrived. She spent long nights in the library, poring over textbooks and practicing skills until they became second nature. When she graduated at the top of her class, the sense of accomplishment was bittersweet. She had proven herself, but the journey had been far lonelier than it should have been. Now, at Riverside, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that she was facing the same unspoken barriers. As she reflected on her first 2 days, she began to piece together a troubling pattern. Her assignments weren't just difficult, they were disproportionately challenging compared to those given to her colleagues. While others managed straightforward cases, Lisa was repeatedly tasked with handling the most complex and difficult patients. Even routine tasks seemed to come with an extra layer of scrutiny, as though everyone was waiting for her to slip up. Then there was Dr. Hayes. His dismissive tone, his pointed criticisms, it all felt deliberate, calculated to undermine her confidence. Lisa replayed their interactions in her mind, searching for any indication that she was imagining things, but the pattern was undeniable. It wasn't just her perception. The treatment she was receiving wasn't random. It was intentional. The thought made her stomach twist with anger and frustration. Lisa had faced bias before, but this felt different. This felt like sabotage, but as the anger simmered, it also ignited something deeper, a determination not to let anyone break her. She thought about her mother's words, about her grandmother's resilience, about every obstacle she had already overcome. Giving up wasn't an option, not for her, and not for the countless others who would one day follow in her footsteps. Lisa spent the rest of the evening preparing herself mentally for the days ahead. She reviewed patient charts, double-checked hospital protocols, and even practiced potential responses to Dr. Hayes' criticisms. If they were going to test her, she would be ready. She wasn't just going to survive at Riverside, she was going to excel. As Lisa finally lay down to sleep, the doubts that had plagued her earlier felt smaller, less significant. The road ahead would undoubtedly be difficult, but she wasn't walking it alone. She carried with her the strength of the women who had come before her, the encouragement of her mother, and the quiet but unmistakable resolve to prove her worth, not to them, but to herself. What Lisa didn't know was that the challenges she had faced so far were just the beginning. The days to come would bring even greater obstacles, but they would also bring something else, something she couldn't yet see. For someone had been watching her, quietly observing her strength and resilience, and that someone would soon change everything. The hum of Riverside Medical Center was constant, a blend of beeping monitors, hurried footsteps, and hushed conversations. Lisa moved through the corridors with quiet determination, her polished demeanor masking the storm of emotions swirling inside her. It was her third day, and she was beginning to find her rhythm, if only to protect herself from the invisible but ever-present weight of scrutiny. James Mitchell sat propped up in his hospital bed, the morning light streaming through the blinds of room 407. His casted arm rested on a pillow, and a notebook lay open on his lap. He seemed to be jotting something down as he glanced toward the doorway, where Lisa walked by briskly, clipboard in hand. His sharp eyes followed her, narrowing slightly. This wasn't the first time he'd seen her today, nor the first time he'd noticed the quiet tension that seemed to surround her. Lisa had stopped by his room earlier to check his vitals. Their interaction had been brief, professional on her end, polite, but reserved on his. James was a man of few words, but his gaze spoke volumes. He had sensed something beneath her calm exterior, a strength tempered by struggle. As she left his room, he'd noticed the way her shoulders stiffened when she passed the nurse's station, where a cluster of staff exchanged whispers and subtle glances in her direction. James leaned back against his pillow, his mind racing. He had spent decades in environments where unspoken hierarchies and undercurrents dictated behavior, and what he was observing at Riverside felt all too familiar. People underestimated him, thinking his current condition made him invisible. But James was always watching, always listening, and what he was beginning to piece together about Lisa Daniels intrigued him. Later that morning, Lisa returned to room 407 to administer medication. She entered with her usual warm but professional demeanor, her smile genuine despite the challenges she faced. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell," she said, glancing at the monitor beside his bed. "How are you feeling today?" James closed his notebook, setting it aside. "Morning, Nurse Daniels," he replied evenly. "Better, thanks to your care." Lisa smiled faintly as she prepared his medication, her movements precise and efficient. "Just doing my job," she said, keeping her tone light. "And doing it well," James added, his voice calm but deliberate. He watched her closely as she adjusted his IV, noting the slight tension in her jaw and the faint shadow of exhaustion under her eyes. "You've been busy." "It's a hospital," Lisa replied with a soft chuckle, avoiding eye contact. "Busy is part of the deal." James said nothing, but his gaze lingered on her. When Lisa finished, she turned to leave, and as she did, their eyes met for a brief moment. There was something in his expression, an unspoken understanding, as if he could see through the mask she wore. It unsettled her, but she quickly recovered, offering him a polite nod before stepping into the hallway. The next time James saw Lisa was during her lunch break. She had chosen a quiet corner of the staff lounge, away from the other nurses who gathered in groups, chatting and laughing. Lisa sat alone, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the sandwich in her hands as though willing herself to focus on anything but the isolation she felt. From his vantage point near the nurses' station, James observed the way others interacted, or rather didn't interact with her. He noticed how they glanced at her briefly before turning back to their conversations, their expressions neutral, but their body language dismissive. It was subtle, but to someone like James, who had spent a lifetime reading people, it was glaringly obvious. As Lisa finished her lunch and returned to her rounds, James heard a snippet of conversation between two nurses at the station. "She's trying way too hard," one of them said, her voice low but tinged with mockery. "Did you see how she double-checked that chart earlier? It's like she's terrified of making a mistake." The other nurse laughed quietly. Probably because she knows one slip-up and she's out. They only hired her to check a box anyway. James felt his jaw tighten, the words igniting a slow burn of anger in his chest. He glanced toward the hallway where Lisa had disappeared moments ago, her head held high despite the quiet storm brewing behind her. There was no doubt in his mind now. This wasn't just a matter of adjusting to a new job. Lisa Daniels was being deliberately isolated and undermined, and the reasons were painfully clear. Later that afternoon, James's suspicions deepened when Dr. Hayes entered his room during a routine check-in. The senior doctor's demeanor was polished, his tone professional, but there was a stiffness to his interactions with Lisa that didn't escape James's notice. As Lisa explained James's medication schedule, Dr. Hayes interrupted her, his voice sharp. "Actually, Nurse Daniels," he said, his tone clipped, "that dosage was adjusted this morning. You should know that." Lisa blinked, caught off guard. "I wasn't informed of any changes, Dr. Hayes. I'll make sure to update the chart." Dr. Hayes smirked faintly, as though he had caught her in a mistake. "I suggest you stay on top of these things. We can't afford to have patients' care compromised." James's eyes flicked between the two, his gaze hardening as he watched Lisa nod and remain composed under the doctor's thinly veiled reprimand. She apologized politely, her voice steady, but James could see the tension in her shoulders as she adjusted the IV and made a note in his chart. When Dr. Hayes left the room, James broke the silence. "You handled that well," he said, his tone neutral but meaningful. Lisa looked up, startled. "Handled what?" "The way he spoke to you," James replied. "Not everyone has that kind of poise." Lisa hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "It's part of the job," she said finally, her voice guarded. "Staying professional no matter what." James tilted his head slightly, studying her. "Is that what they taught you in nursing school? Or did you have to figure it out on your own?" Lisa's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment James thought she might ignore the question entirely. But then she sighed, her expression softening. "Both," she admitted. "You learned quickly that not everyone wants to see you succeed." James nodded slowly, his suspicions confirmed. "You've got more patience than I would," he said, his tone laced with quiet respect. Lisa offered him a faint smile before excusing herself, but as she left, James's mind was racing. The more he observed, the clearer the picture became. Lisa Daniels wasn't just fighting for respect. She was fighting to survive in an environment that seemed intent on pushing her out. And James, who had built his career on exposing injustice in all its forms, couldn't ignore what he was seeing. As the day wound down, James remained watchful and taking note of every interaction Lisa had with the staff. He saw the way her colleagues avoided eye contact, the way conversations hushed when she entered a room, and the way Dr. Hayes' criticism seemed designed to erode her confidence. By the time Lisa returned to his room to check his vitals one last time, James had made up his mind. He didn't know exactly how, but he was going to do something about it. For now, he kept his observations to himself, his calm exterior betraying none of the resolve building inside him. But as he watched Lisa leave his room that evening, her steps heavy but determined, James knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let this continue. What Lisa didn't yet realize was that she had an ally in her corner, and he was just getting started. The morning air inside Riverside Medical Center was thick with tension, though Lisa Daniels moved with her usual focus and composure. She had resolved to take each day as it came, pushing aside the undercurrent of hostility that seemed to shadow her every step. But as soon as she arrived at the nurses' station, she felt the weight of someone's gaze on her. Dr. Hayes stood nearby, clipboard in hand, his expression unreadable. "Nurse Daniels," he called, his voice cutting through the morning chatter. The other nurses immediately fell silent, their eyes darting toward Lisa. "A word." Lisa straightened her back, refusing to let the unease she felt show. "Yes, Dr. Hayes?" Dr. Hayes walked over to her, lowering his voice just enough to make the conversation seem private, while ensuring everyone within earshot could still hear. "Room 309, Mr. Briggs. He's been difficult this morning. You'll be taking over his care." Lisa's stomach tightened. She knew the name. Mr. Briggs had gained a reputation for being one of the most challenging patients in the hospital. He was an older man recovering from surgery, but his medical history wasn't what made him difficult. It was his behavior. Aggressive, combative, and, according to rumors, openly racist. "I understand," Lisa said evenly, her face betraying none of her apprehension. "I trust you'll handle it professionally," Dr. Hayes added, his tone laced with something that felt more like a warning than encouragement. "This hospital doesn't tolerate mistakes, Nurse Daniels." Lisa nodded, resisting the urge to point out that she hadn't made any mistakes. Instead, she gathered the necessary supplies and made her way to room 309, her steps measured but purposeful. As she entered, the atmosphere in the room was oppressive, and the air tinged with the sharp scent of antiseptic and something less tangible: hostility. Mr. Briggs sat upright in his bed, his face twisted into a scowl. His graying hair was disheveled, and his eyes, sharp and unkind, narrowed as soon as he saw Lisa. "Well, isn't this just great?" he muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. "They sent me one of you." Lisa paused for a fraction of a second, long enough to register the insult but not long enough to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She offered a calm, professional smile. "Good morning, Mr. Briggs. I'm Nurse Daniels, and I'll be taking care of you today." "I don't want your help," he snapped, his tone venomous. "I already told them I don't want someone like you touching me." Lisa kept her voice steady, her hands working methodically as she began checking his vitals. "I'm here to ensure your recovery goes smoothly, Mr. Briggs. Let me know if you're experiencing any discomfort." "Oh, I'm uncomfortable, all right," he spat. "Uncomfortable that they've got people like you working here. Standards must be slipping." The words stung, but Lisa refused to let them penetrate the wall of professionalism she had built around herself. She focused on the task at hand, maintaining her composure despite the steady stream of slurs and insults that followed her every move. "You people don't belong here," he continued, his voice growing louder. "You're not qualified. You probably got this job just so they could tick some diversity box." Lisa clenched her jaw but didn't respond. She finished adjusting his IV and stepped back, checking his chart to ensure everything was in order. As she turned to leave, Mr. Briggs's voice followed her. "Figures you wouldn't have anything to say," he sneered. "No real nurse would let a patient talk to them like this. But I guess you're not a real nurse, are you?" Lisa left the room without a word, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the chart. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before returning to the nurse's station. The other staff members barely glanced at her as she updated the notes on Mr. Briggs's file. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, a mix of anger, frustration, and exhaustion. But there was no time to process it. Dr. Hayes's voice cut through the air again. "Nurse Daniels," he called from across the hall, his tone sharp. "A moment, please." Lisa approached him, her expression calm but guarded. Dr. Hayes held up a chart, flipping through the pages with exaggerated precision. "There seems to be a discrepancy in Mr. Briggs's medication log," he said loudly enough for several nearby staff members to hear. "Care to explain?" Lisa frowned, quickly reviewing the notes. "I logged everything correctly," she said, her voice steady but firm. "The dosage and timing match the doctor's orders." Dr. Hayes raised an eyebrow, his smirk barely concealed. "And yet, the previous entry contradicts your notes. Did you not double-check the patient's chart before administering the medication?" Lisa's stomach dropped. She had checked the chart thoroughly, as she always did. But before she could explain, Dr. Hayes continued, his voice growing louder. "This is exactly the kind of oversight we can't afford in a hospital of this caliber, Nurse Daniels. Perhaps you need a refresher on proper protocol." The hallway grew uncomfortably silent as Lisa felt the weight of every eye on her. Her face burned with humiliation, but she forced herself to remain composed. "I followed protocol, Dr. Hayes," she said calmly. "If there's been a mistake, I'll investigate it immediately." "See that you do," Dr. Hayes said coldly before turning and walking away, leaving Lisa standing alone in the middle of the corridor. The whispers began almost immediately, soft murmurs that seemed to grow louder as she returned to the nurse's station. Lisa worked through the rest of her shift in a haze, the emotional toll of the day pressing down on her like a heavy weight. She replayed the interaction with Dr. Hayes over and over in her mind, searching for what she could have done differently, even though she knew she had done everything by the book. The humiliation of being called out in front of her colleagues stung, but it was the realization that it had been deliberate that hurt the most. By the end of the day, Lisa felt drained, her usually steady resolve wavering under the strain. As she gathered her things from her locker, she overheard two nurses talking nearby. "She actually stood there and argued with Dr. Hayes," one of them said, laughing quietly. "She's not going to last long." "Well, what did she expect?" the other replied. "You can't just walk in here and think you're going to change things. This place has its way of weeding people out." Lisa closed her locker softly, the words ringing in her ears. She walked through the hospital's sliding doors and into the cool evening air, her heart heavy but her mind resolute. She had known this job would be hard, but the reality was proving to be far more isolating than she had imagined. As she made her way to the bus stop, Lisa thought about her mother's words and the strength of the women who had come before her. They hadn't given up, and neither would she. But something needed to change. The thought of enduring this kind of treatment indefinitely felt unbearable. Little did Lisa know she wasn't the only one who had taken note of what had happened that day. From his bed in room 407, James Mitchell had overheard every word of the exchange between Lisa and Dr. Hayes. His sharp eyes had caught the subtle smirks on the faces of the staff who had watched the scene unfold, their silence speaking louder than words. James sat back against his pillow, his mind churning with anger and determination. Something about Lisa's quiet strength struck a chord in him, and he decided then and there that enough was enough. The morning light filtered softly through the blinds of room 407, casting faint stripes across the polished floor. James Mitchell sat upright in his bed, his arm still encased in its cast, though his sharp eyes showed no sign of the weariness typical of most patients. He was deep in thought, the events of the previous day replaying in his mind like a movie he couldn't turn off. The humiliation Lisa Daniels had endured at the hands of Dr. Hayes was fresh in his memory. It hadn't been subtle, nor was it accidental. It was a calculated act designed to diminish her in front of her peers. James had witnessed enough power plays in his life to recognize one when he saw it. The difference now was that he had the ability to do something about it. James heard the light knock on his door before it opened. Lisa stepped inside, her expression composed, her movements purposeful as she prepared for the day's routine. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice steady. "How are you feeling today?" "Good morning, Nurse Daniels," James replied, his tone warm but measured. "I'm feeling much better, thank you." Lisa gave a small smile as she moved to check his IV and monitor. "That's what I like to hear. Let's make sure everything is in order." For a moment, there was silence as Lisa worked, her focus on the task at hand. James watched her closely, noticing the slight tension in her posture, the faint shadow of exhaustion beneath her eyes. Finally, he broke the quiet. "Nurse Daniels," he said, his voice calm but deliberate. "I've been meaning to ask, how long have you been at Riverside?" Lisa glanced up, slightly surprised by the question. "This is my first week," she replied. "Still getting used to the rhythm of things." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You seem to handle yourself well, especially considering the challenges." Lisa paused, her hands momentarily still. "Challenges come with any new job," she said carefully, her tone neutral. "True," James replied, his gaze steady. "But not everyone has to work twice as hard just to be seen as competent." Lisa's head snapped up, her eyes locking onto his. For a moment, she wasn't sure what to say. The way he spoke, the way he looked at her, it was as if he understood what she was going through without her having to say a word. She forced a small smile, brushing off the comment. "It's part of the job," she said, returning to her work. James tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as if studying her. "You shouldn't have to accept that as part of the job," he said quietly. "You deserve better." The words caught Lisa off guard. In the sterile, often impersonal environment of Riverside, kindness like this was rare. She didn't know what to make of it, but she felt a faint flicker of something she hadn't felt in days. Hope. "Thank you, Mr. Mitchell," she said softly, meeting his gaze briefly before returning to her chart. James watched her finish her work, his mind racing. He had spent his life navigating systems where power and privilege dictated outcomes, and he knew firsthand how those systems could crush people like Lisa if left unchecked. He couldn't stand by and watch it happen, not this time. But he also knew he needed to proceed carefully. There was a time and place for revealing his hand, and this wasn't it. Later that day, during a routine medical checkup, James decided to plant the first seed of his plan. Dr. Hayes entered the room with his usual brisk energy, clipboard in hand. Lisa followed a few steps behind, her expression calm but guarded. James noted the dynamic between them immediately, the way Dr. Hayes barely acknowledged Lisa, the way she maintained her professionalism despite the obvious dismissal. "Good afternoon, Mr. Mitchell," Dr. Hayes said, his tone clipped. "Let's see how you're progressing." James nodded politely, watching as Dr. Hayes began his examination. The senior doctor rattled off a series of medical updates, speaking more to the clipboard than to James himself. Lisa stood nearby, quietly recording the details in the patient log. "Your recovery seems to be proceeding well," Dr. Hayes concluded, snapping the clipboard shut. "If all goes as planned, you should be discharged within the next week." "Excellent news," James replied, his tone neutral. "Though I must say, my time here has been enlightening." Dr. Hayes raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Enlightening," he repeated. James leaned back against his pillow, his gaze steady. "You learn a lot about an organization when you're observing from the inside," he said casually. "The way people interact, the way challenges are handled. It gives you a sense of what kind of leadership is steering the ship." Dr. Hayes straightened slightly, his expression flickering with faint unease. "I assure you, Mr. Mitchell, Riverside operates under the highest standards of professionalism and care." "Does it?" James asked, his tone calm but pointed. "Because from where I'm sitting, I've noticed some troubling dynamics." Lisa froze, her pen hovering over the log. James's words hung in the air, the tension in the room palpable. Dr. Hayes's smile tightened, though he quickly regained his composure. "I'm not sure what you mean," he said smoothly. "But if there's an issue, I'd be happy to address it." James's eyes flicked briefly to Lisa before returning to Dr. Hayes. "Oh, I'm sure the issues will be addressed," he said, his voice even. "In due time." Dr. Hayes frowned slightly, clearly puzzled by the comment. "Well," he said after a pause, "if there's nothing else, I'll leave you in Nurse Daniel's capable hands." James nodded politely, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Doctor." As Dr. Hayes left the room, Lisa glanced at James, her brow furrowed. "That was interesting," she said cautiously. James gave her a faint smile. "Just an observation," he said lightly, "nothing more." But Lisa wasn't convinced. There was something in his tone, something in the way he had spoken to Dr. Hayes, that hinted at more than he was letting on. She didn't know what it meant, but for the first time since she started at Riverside, she felt like someone might be on her side. The rest of the day passed in a blur, but James's words stayed with Lisa. She found herself replaying the interaction in her mind, wondering what he had meant by troubling dynamics and in due time. It was clear he had been deliberate in his choice of words, but why? What was he trying to accomplish? Lisa wasn't used to having allies, especially not in a place like Riverside. She had spent most of her career fighting battles on her own, relying on her resilience and determination to get her through. But something about James felt different. He wasn't just watching. He was paying attention, truly seeing her in a way that no one else at the hospital seemed willing to. As she finished her shift and prepared to leave, Lisa passed by room 407-1 last time. James was sitting up in bed, his notebook open on his lap. He glanced up as she walked by, offering her a small nod. Lisa hesitated for a moment before nodding back, a faint smile tugging at her lips. For the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope, small but steady. She didn't know what James Mitchell's story was or why he seemed so invested in hers, but she was grateful for his quiet support. And as she stepped into the cool evening air, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. She didn't know how or when, but she knew one thing for certain. James wasn't just another patient. He was a force to be reckoned with, and he wasn't done yet. The day began like any other at Riverside Medical Center, with Lisa arriving early, her mind already focused on the day's tasks. She reviewed her assignments at the nurses' station, scanning the list of patients and double-checking her notes from the day before. The routine felt grounding, a small pocket of control in an environment that so often tested her limits. But just as Lisa began her rounds, head nurse Wilson approached, clipboard in hand, her expression unusually tense. "Daniels," she said briskly, "Dr. Hayes has requested you to assist in a high-stakes operation this afternoon." Lisa's heart skipped a beat. High-stakes operations were rare and typically reserved for senior staff. It wasn't lost on her that this was likely another test, a chance for Dr. Hayes to scrutinize her under the highest pressure. "Of course," Lisa replied, keeping her voice steady. "What's the case?" Wilson glanced at her clipboard. "Patient in room 407. James Mitchell." Lisa's breath caught for a moment. James. She had come to know him as a sharp observer, a man of quiet strength and subtle authority. The thought of assisting in his surgery felt both daunting and oddly personal. "Understood," she said, nodding. "You'll need to prep the patient and report to the operating room at 2 p.m. sharp." Wilson continued, her tone clipped. "Be ready." Lisa spent the morning preparing, meticulously reviewing James's file and the surgical plan. His operation was complicated, repairing internal damage caused by a secondary issue stemming from his initial injury. The risks were high, and Lisa knew the stakes extended beyond the surgery itself. Dr. Hayes' presence meant her every move would be under a microscope, and there was no room for error. When Lisa entered James's room to prep him for the operation, he greeted her with a calm smile, though his sharp eyes betrayed a flicker of tension. "Nurse Daniels," he said, his voice steady. "Looks like we'll be working together again." Lisa returned his smile, her professionalism intact despite the knot of nerves tightening in her chest. "That's right, Mr. Mitchell. I'll be assisting during your procedure today." "I couldn't ask for better," James replied, his tone genuine. His confidence in her felt like a lifeline, a small but powerful reassurance that she carried with her as she prepared him for transport. The operating room was a hive of controlled chaos, with staff moving swiftly to finalize preparations. The air was cool, sterile, and heavy with the weight of expectation. Lisa stood near the surgical instruments, her gloves on, her focus sharp as she awaited instructions. Dr. Hayes entered, his presence commanding as always, though Lisa caught a flicker of something in his expression. Was it nerves? He greeted the surgical team briskly, reviewing the plan with the surgeons and anesthesiologist before glancing at Lisa. "Daniels," he said curtly, "I trust you're ready." "Yes, doctor," Lisa replied, her voice steady. The surgery began smoothly, with Dr. Hayes leading the team. Lisa worked efficiently, anticipating the surgeons' needs, handing them instruments before they even had to ask. She moved with precision, her training and experience shining through despite the pressure. But as the operation progressed, Lisa noticed a subtle change in Dr. Hayes' demeanor. His movements, so confident at the start, became slightly less assured. It was almost imperceptible, but Lisa's trained eye caught it, the slight tremor in his hands, the momentary hesitation before an incision. She felt a pang of unease, her instincts telling her to stay alert. Then it happened. Dr. Hayes prepared to make a critical cut near a major artery. Lisa's eyes widened as she realized his angle was off, just enough to risk catastrophic damage. Her heart raced as she calculated the odds, knowing that if she didn't intervene, the patient's life could be at stake. "Dr. Hayes," she said, her voice calm but firm, cutting through the tense silence of the room. "The angle may be too steep. Adjusting slightly could reduce the risk of hitting the artery. The room went still. All eyes turned to Lisa, and for a moment it felt as though time had frozen. Dr. Hayes looked up, his expression a mixture of surprise and indignation. "Excuse me," he said, his tone sharp. Lisa held her ground, her voice unwavering. "The artery is closer than it appears on the imaging. A slight adjustment could prevent unnecessary risk." For a moment, it seemed as though Dr. Hayes might dismiss her outright. His lips pressed into a thin line, his gaze hardening. But then another surgeon spoke up. "She's right," he said, his voice measured. "The imaging suggests a closer margin. Adjusting the angle would be safer." Dr. Hayes's jaw tightened, but he gave a terse nod, adjusting his approach. The room remained silent as he completed the incision with the corrected angle. The procedure continued without further complications, and James's vitals remained stable throughout. When the surgery concluded successfully, the room exhaled as one. The tension that had gripped the team dissipated, replaced by the quiet relief of a job well done. Dr. Hayes removed his gloves, his expression unreadable as he glanced briefly at Lisa before addressing the team. "Good work, everyone," he said curtly before leaving the room. Lisa stayed behind to assist with post-op procedures, her mind racing. She knew she had done the right thing, but the weight of what had just happened pressed heavily on her chest. Speaking up had been a risk, one that could have easily backfired. But as she looked at James, now stabilized and ready to be moved to recovery, she felt a small surge of pride. He was safe, and that was what mattered most. Later that evening, Lisa visited James in the recovery room to check on him. He was groggy but alert, his sharp eyes meeting hers as she adjusted his IV. "Looks like I owe you one," he said, his voice low but steady. Lisa smiled faintly, shaking her head. "Just doing my job, Mr. Mitchell." James studied her for a moment before speaking again. "Not everyone would have done what you did in there. It takes guts to stand up in a room like that, especially with someone like Hayes." Lisa hesitated, unsure how to respond. "I just wanted to make sure you were safe," she said finally. James gave her a small, knowing smile. "And you did, but don't sell yourself short, Nurse Daniels. That was more than just doing your job." Lisa felt a faint warmth in her chest at his words, but before she could reply, James continued. "By the way," he said, his tone light but deliberate, "I'll be sure to mention your quick thinking when I talk to the administration." Lisa blinked, her brows furrowing slightly. "The administration?" James chuckled softly, though his voice carried a weight that hinted at something deeper. "Let's just say I have a way of making sure good work doesn't go unnoticed." And the words hung in the air, their meaning unclear but significant. Lisa felt a flicker of curiosity mingled with cautious hope. James wasn't just a patient. Of that much she was certain. And whatever his role was, he seemed determined to ensure that she got the recognition she deserved. As she left the recovery room, Lisa felt a quiet strength rising within her. The day had tested her in ways she hadn't anticipated, but she had proven her worth, not just to herself, but to those around her. And though she didn't yet know what James's words would lead to, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much larger. The day after James Mitchell's successful operation, the atmosphere at Riverside Medical Center was thick with anticipation. Word of the high-stakes surgery had spread quickly, and whispers of Lisa Daniels' critical intervention circulated among the staff. But just as quickly as the murmurs of praise began, they were overshadowed by the unmistakable tension surrounding Dr. Hayes. His usual air of authority seemed diminished, his clipped instructions carrying an edge of defensiveness that hadn't been there before. Lisa arrived for her shift with the same quiet determination she carried every day, but something about the energy in the hospital felt different. As she made her rounds, she noticed the way her colleagues avoided meeting her eyes. The usual whispers followed her, but now they seemed laced with uncertainty rather than outright disdain. It was as if the staff sensed that something was about to happen, but didn't know what or when. Late in the morning, Lisa was called to James's room for a routine check-in. When she entered, she found him sitting upright in bed, looking far more alert and composed than he had the day before. He greeted her with a warm smile, but there was an intensity in his gaze that caught her off guard. "Good morning, Nurse Daniels," James said, his tone calm but purposeful. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell," Lisa replied, her professionalism intact despite the strange tension in the air. "How are you feeling today?" "Better than ever, thanks to you," James said, his words carrying a weight that made Lisa pause. "And I think it's about time we had a conversation." Lisa frowned slightly, unsure of what he meant. "Of course," she said, her voice cautious. "Is there something you need clarified about your care?" James shook his head, his smile widening just enough to convey that he knew more than he was letting on. "No, Nurse Daniels. I think you've more than proven your expertise, but there's something you should know. Something I think everyone here should know." Before Lisa could respond, the door opened and 2 senior administrators entered, their expressions a mix of confusion and concern. One of them, Mr. Patterson, was the hospital's CEO. Lisa's stomach tightened as she realized the gravity of the moment. Whatever was happening, it was far beyond the scope of her usual duties. James gestured for them to take a seat, his demeanor calm but commanding. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice steady. "I've spent the past week here as a patient, and while my stay has been enlightening, it has also been deeply troubling." The administrators exchanged uneasy glances, their attention fixed on James. "Mr. Mitchell," Patterson began, his tone cautious, "we appreciate your feedback, but—" James held up a hand, silencing him with a gesture that was both polite and firm. "Allow me to introduce myself properly," he said, his eyes flicking briefly to Lisa before returning to the administrators. "My name is James Mitchell, and I am the CEO of Harmony Healthcare Group, one of the largest medical networks in the country." The room went still. Lisa's breath caught in her throat as the weight of his words sank in. Harmony Healthcare Group was a powerhouse in the industry, overseeing dozens of hospitals, clinics, and research facilities nationwide. James wasn't just a patient. He was a figure of immense influence, someone whose opinion could shape the future of an institution like Riverside. Patterson's face paled, his composure faltering. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, his voice shaky, "if we'd known—" "That's precisely the point," James interrupted, his tone sharp. "You didn't know. And because of that, I was able to observe this hospital without the usual polish that comes with catering to VIPs. What I witnessed was a culture that is deeply flawed, one that prioritizes appearances over accountability and allows discrimination to fester unchecked." Lisa stood frozen, her heart pounding as James's words echoed in the room. She had suspected he was more than he appeared, but she hadn't imagined this. "I've watched how staff interact, how power dynamics play out," James continued, his voice growing more forceful. "And what I've seen is unacceptable. Good employees are undermined, exceptional care is dismissed, and systemic bias is allowed to thrive. Nurse Daniels, for example, has been subjected to treatment that no professional should ever have to endure. And yet, she has continued to excel despite the odds." James turned his gaze to Patterson, his expression hardening. Dr. Hayes, in particular, has displayed behavior that is not only unprofessional but dangerous. During my surgery, his hesitation nearly cost me my life. It was Nurse Daniels who stepped in, saving me from what could have been a catastrophic mistake. And yet, this same nurse has been subjected to his condescension and hostility since the day she arrived. Patterson looked as though he might faint. "Mr. Mitchell, I assure you—" "No," James said firmly, cutting him off. "You don't assure me of anything. What I want to know is what you're going to do to address this." The silence that followed was deafening. Patterson stammered, searching for words, but before he could form a coherent response, the door opened again. Dr. Hayes stepped inside, his expression a mixture of confusion and irritation. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his eyes scanning the room before landing on James. "Dr. Hayes," James said, his tone icy. "Perfect timing. I was just discussing your conduct." Dr. Hayes stiffened, his gaze flickering to Lisa for a moment before returning to James. "My conduct?" he repeated, his voice defensive. "I don't know what you've been told, but—" "I've seen enough to draw my own conclusions," James interrupted, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "You've created an environment that undermines your staff and prioritizes your ego over patient safety. Your behavior during my surgery was reckless, and your treatment of Nurse Daniels has been nothing short of disgraceful." Dr. Hayes's face reddened, his usual composure cracking under the weight of James's words. "With all due respect, Mr. Mitchell," he said, his voice shaking, "I've run this department for years, and perhaps it's time someone else took over," James said coldly. "Because from where I'm standing, you're a liability." The room fell silent once more, the weight of James's authority crushing any further protests. Patterson cleared his throat, his voice weak but deferential. "Mr. Mitchell, I assure you that we take these concerns very seriously. We will launch a full investigation into Dr. Hayes's conduct and the broader issues you've raised." "I expect nothing less," James replied, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "And let me be clear, my involvement with Riverside doesn't end when I leave this room. I'll be monitoring your progress closely, and I expect real, measurable changes." As the administrators and Dr. Hayes left the room, their faces pale and their postures stiff, James turned to Lisa, his expression softening. "Nurse Daniels," he said, his voice quieter now, "you've shown more strength and professionalism in 1 week than most people show in a lifetime. Don't ever let anyone convince you that you don't belong." Lisa felt her throat tighten, her emotions a whirlwind of relief, gratitude, and disbelief. "Thank you, Mr. Mitchell," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," James replied with a small smile. "Just keep doing what you're doing. The rest will take care of itself." As Lisa left the room, the weight she had carried for days felt lighter. The reckoning had begun, and for the first time she felt like the tide was finally turning. In the days following James Mitchell's revelations, Riverside Medical Center was a different place. The quiet tension that had once permeated the halls had been replaced with an electric charge of change. Staff whispered about the hospital's sudden reckoning, the rapid investigation into Dr. Hayes's behavior, and the shocking truth about James's identity. For Lisa, the change was palpable. Colleagues who had once dismissed her now approached her with tentative smiles, some offering awkward but genuine apologies. A nurse who had once ignored her attempts at small talk stopped her in the lounge. "Lisa," the nurse began, her voice hesitant, I owe you an apology. The way I treated you wasn't right, and I'm sorry." Lisa met the nurse's gaze, searching for sincerity. When she saw it, she nodded. "Thank you," she said simply. She wasn't one to hold grudges, but forgiveness came on her terms. One morning, as Lisa prepared for her shift, she was called to the administrator's office. Her stomach tightened as she walked through the doors, unsure of what to expect. Inside, Mr. Patterson stood with a warm smile, James Mitchell seated beside him, looking as composed and commanding as ever. "Lisa," Patterson began, gesturing for her to sit, "we wanted to meet with you to discuss the future of Riverside and your role in it." Lisa sat cautiously, glancing between Patterson and James. "Your contributions over the past week have been extraordinary," Patterson continued. "You've demonstrated resilience, professionalism, and an unwavering commitment to your patients. It's clear that you're exactly the kind of leader this hospital needs." Lisa's heart raced as Patterson slid a folder across the table. She opened it, her eyes scanning the contents. At the top of the document was a title that made her breath catch: Director of Diversity and Inclusion Initiatives. "We want you to spearhead a comprehensive program to address the systemic issues that have come to light," Patterson said. "You'll have the authority to implement real change, not just here, but as a model for other facilities in our network." Lisa looked up, her eyes wide. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," James interjected with a warm smile. "Your story, your strength, it's what the healthcare system needs. This isn't just about Riverside. This is about building something bigger, something better." Lisa's throat tightened, a rush of emotions overwhelming her. Gratitude, disbelief, pride, it all swirled together, leaving her momentarily speechless. Finally, she nodded. "I'd be honored." The news spread quickly. Lisa Daniels, once overlooked and underestimated, was now leading the charge for change at Riverside. Staff who had once avoided her now sought her out for guidance, eager to understand her perspective and contribute to the hospital's transformation. The shift was slow but steady, a reflection of the culture Lisa was determined to rebuild. In her new role, Lisa implemented mandatory training sessions, established open forums for staff to share their experiences, and created mentorship programs to support underrepresented employees. The work was challenging, but for the first time, Lisa felt like she was making a tangible difference, not just for herself, but for the countless others who would follow in her footsteps. One afternoon, as Lisa walked through the halls of Riverside, she found James Mitchell waiting near the nurses' station. He greeted her with a smile, his cast now removed, his presence as commanding as ever. "Mr. Mitchell," Lisa said, her tone light, "shouldn't you be taking it easy?" James chuckled. "I'm not very good at taking it easy," he admitted. "But I wanted to see how you're settling into your new role." "It's been incredible," Lisa replied. "Challenging, but worth every moment." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You've done more than just transform this hospital, Lisa. You've inspired something much bigger." Lisa tilted her head, curiosity sparking in her eyes. "What do you mean?" "I've been thinking," James said. His tone measured. "Your story, your journey, it's a blueprint for the kind of reform healthcare needs on a national scale. If Riverside can change, why can't every hospital?" Lisa's breath caught as the weight of his words sank in. "You really think that's possible?" James smiled. "With the right people leading the charge? Absolutely." That evening, as Lisa left the hospital, she paused outside the building, looking up at its gleaming facade. The place that had once felt cold and unwelcoming was now the epicenter of something extraordinary. She thought about her first day, the whispered comments, the dismissive glances. She thought about her mother's words, the strength of the women who had come before her, and the quiet resolve that had carried her through. Lisa took a deep breath, a sense of peace washing over her. Her journey wasn't over, far from it, but for the first time, she felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. And so, Lisa Daniels' story became more than just a tale of perseverance. It became a catalyst for change, a reminder that one voice, one act of courage, can spark a revolution. What would you have done in Lisa's shoes? Have you ever faced challenges that pushed you to grow stronger? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't miss our next story, where an unexpected hero turns the tide in a battle for justice. Trust me, you won't want to miss this one.